Hi, so YouTube, back at it again. Today's actually the 5th anniversary since the first YouTube video I uploaded, so I was kind of stringing that out a bit to this date just so I could upload on this date. Otherwise, if I'd uploaded this video that I was going to make the other week, you don't care. Anyway, video now. So a big conversation that has been happening definitely within my circles, whether that's social or professional, is about the description of what is called the autism spectrum. And this really has been a conversation I've certainly been involved in all year. So I just wanted to, as we're getting to the end of the year, consolidate all those thoughts and present them to you, and understand where other people are at with it. Because yeah, it's a big one. It's a big one. But yeah, I like the fact that we are a community that challenges things. So let's begin. So to outline the history of it / the positives of it, because it was brought in for good intentions. There is, we have to bring that up from the beginning. It wasn't made to be something to have negative effect. It was done for purely the reason to help individualism be associated with autism. To understand that not every autistic individual is the same. Now, autism is something that predominantly has been medically diagnosed, and in medical diagnoses, on the whole, it tends to be, here's your diagnosis, therefore this equals this, as opposed to with autism, where it's, oh, so we believe this person is autistic, therefore they might be like this. There's no direct correlation. There's a vast array of autistic traits. And not every single person will hit every single one of them. So the whole idea of a spectrum was to go, actually, what we mean is that it's not going to align. We can't just tell you what you are autistic, therefore you behave like this. It doesn't work like that. The diagnosis is only ever the start of a conversation to then figure out what is best for the individual, what is the individual's needs. And I think for the most part, the spectrum's done a brilliant way of communicating that to people, that it's not just a one-size-fits-all. It's been particularly useful for people like myself who actually mask quite a lot, to be able to get through to people who don't have the understanding of how, autistic behaviours may not be visibly present. It's really given them understanding to go, oh, okay, wait, it's fine that that you may not be presenting how I believe autism to be. That's an issue in itself, but it's done good at widening people's idea of what it can mean to be autistic. So then we have to look at where we are now. I made a key point there that it was predominantly used to be able to give people who had a medical understanding of autism that it wasn't here is a list of traits and behaviours, or symptoms, as it would be in that space anyway, especially initially. The spectrum got thought of as something quite linear, as in a line. The labels used to describe that linear spectrum, you may have heard of things such as classic autism and on one end and Asperger's on the other end. Then you may have also heard of low functioning and high functioning. All these terms aren't terms that we use anymore, because what that tends to do is that linear spectrum generally tends to try and compare autism to intelligence, which is not useful, quite simply. There is no point in describing a spectrum like that. It diminishes the abilities of those who are considered on one end of the spectrum, and it will ignore the needs of those on the other end of the spectrum, because it doesn't work like that. The commonality there is both ends, and this middle section that we just completely ignore apparently. The whole point is there's needs. There are needs, and these needs fall into categories. That's what it means to be autistic. It doesn't mean that you have specific behaviours. It means that you have traits and behaviours that are grouped into an area that we call socialisation, communication, and interaction. We also look at sensory differences, and we also look at people's reliance on certainties and consistencies. The through line for me, that I always describe it as, is it's a brain that looks for the detail before it goes to the bigger picture. Whereas a neurotypical, someone who isn't autistic, would look at the bigger picture and work their way into the detail. I will do a bigger, what I think it means to be autistic, and I'll expand on those 3 areas, but I believe that context is important when talking about the spectrum. To be autistic, you often show differences in all three of those areas. And what that means is it's actually not a minor or major answer. And what I mean by that is you are autistic or you're not. And it's as simple as that. There's no you're a little bit autistic. There's no I definitely think he's somewhere on the spectrum. And that's what the spectrum promotes. It promotes that idea that people assume that the spectrum, as opposed to being those labels that I said earlier, are actually autistic and neurotypical. And that's really not a helpful thing to be in the public consciousness, because that invalidates the specific needs that we're disadvantaged by in our society. I personally believe we have a responsibility now to be challenging this, because it does more harm than good to be talking about an autism spectrum because of those negative implications, those side implications that have appeared. We've tried the spectrum model for a few decades now. I believe it's something that we can park and move on. In other types of neurodiversity is very much the context we look at autism in these days. We don't really talk about spectrums. I've never heard anybody talk about a dyslexic spectrum or an ADHD spectrum. We just understand that people who have those types of brains have X needs often associated with them. I've definitely seen the development of this, particularly in professional resources over the years. We've tried to have things like what you'll often see is a colour wheel, which will just be a circle with like a colour spectrum going everywhere, which for me doesn't represent anything. What that's trying to do is go, oh, it's not linear. But if we think about it, in all of these different areas, in those three areas that I spoke about, it's almost as if there are various mini spectrums within them. Each person's scales are defined upon their own definition of them, therefore it's not an equal comparison. And once again, to compare people to another person, it's not helpful in describing an individual person's specific needs. Now, of course, here is the complication. There is more variance in autistic people than just being autistic. An autistic person could have an additional learning disability, which of course has often been grouped in one area of this linear spectrum. But what that tends to do is when you smush them together, as they have done, is that the individual needs of both the learning disability and the autistic bit haven't been met. But then of course there are other factors that can work in to create a variance in autistic people. It can be things down to gender, it can be things down to race, sexuality, all these things, but then it can also be things like simply that person's past experiences. How long have they been masking for, and how much... Yeah, there's all of that stuff there. Ultimately, what it comes down to, every autistic person is different because we are different people. We don't talk about a neurotypical spectrum. I'm sure we could if we tried to figure it out, but you could tell there'd be loads of neurotypicals that would have a problem with that. Whatever we'd come up with, it wouldn't be sufficient. And equally, that's how I feel it works for us. Now, many people still do use the language. When I'm on my consultation mode, a lot of the stuff I end up doing is making sure that language in communications is up to date and stuff. Depending on the client, I will either not use the spectrum or not penalise them too much for it, because we're certainly not in the phase of spectrum gone, no. But I believe we are in the phase... We're in the dawn. Is the dawn the beginning? Yeah, I think so. We're in the dawn of the end of the spectrum. Dun dun dun. So, so it's been a year-long conversation. I've had this conversation with so many people, and people have seen the advantages, people have seen the disadvantages. I personally believe the best advantage to the spectrum, to describing an autism spectrum, is to undo that whole medical idea of autism being a medical thing, to those people who firmly believe it is a medical thing, because we have to spend so much time going, oh yeah, so you believe it's a medical thing, but it's not like a medical thing. So if only they could just appreciate that, like, oh, so it's clearly not a deficit, it's a neurological difference, and that's the context it needs to live in. Cool, thank you very much for listening to all that. I think I've got every single one of my thoughts out about it. I would be really keen to hear what everyone else feels about it, because it might even be the first time you've heard about this discussion. It's certainly not one that's popped up overnight. It's been one that's been around for a long time. It once again, of course, eliminates ways to speak about people who are autistic, but I think that makes it even more simple autistic is just an adjective to describe somebody who has a brain that has differences in those three areas. Or, simplify it, a brain that focuses on detail. Again, these are personal opinions, but they are backed up by. I'm literally studying neurology at the moment, so it's not based upon nothing. I study sociology and neurology and consume every bit of content I can to try and get the best gauge as to where the autistic community is at. As this is the video that's on the 5th anniversary of me starting YouTube, I thought I'd just lay out, because once again I've just not uploaded in a while. I've realised what it is for social media. I know I've come up with this whole thing of like, oh, I don't like it for a while now, but I finally got the succinct explanation as to why I am perhaps not as active on social media. Social media is all about building up an audience. It's about building up an audience and reaching new people as a small addition. Essentially, you create your own echo chamber, which is great for empowerment and acceptance. I just believe my own personal skills lie better in educating people. So not about cultivating the same audience, always going for different new audiences. This doesn't mean social media isn't a part of that at all, because of course it's a great consolidator to have resources. Meaning that if here I've managed to summarize my entire thoughts about the autism spectrum. So if I can make other said resources that are quite simply reference bases for my existing audience, which, thank you if you're still watching this, it's not been consistent, and people who've been here 5 years as well, thank you to you. It will still be content that can be enjoyed by a typical YouTube audience, but ideally now actually what I am making is a library of content to be referred to audiences that I train, that I educate in many other things. It's quite simply it's the video library of Connor Ward. So yeah, I know what I want to do. Just might take a while between videos, but that's fine. Cool. Well, thank you very much for watching. Please do let me know in the comments your thoughts about the whole autism spectrum thing. As I said, I'm done with it. And I'm done with this video, so bye!